Sorry for the game of musical chairs, but that way we know who is whom, if I haven't made introductions right. So I said that we would take a look at an extremely serious topic that we've talked about at length over this day and a half. So I would like us to look at the consequences on your business as insurers for this Ukrainian war. And I would like to clarify one thing even before I introduce the experts. Most of you know them. The war is still ongoing. There are issues that they won't be able to answer on, or where their answers, well, they can't. There are a lot of things at stake, not just boats, but also people. So sorry for this precaution. So before I introduce our experts, so I have with me Frédéric BÉCARD, the head of the War Risk Committee of France ASSUREURS, and you're working for AXA XL. Yes, exactly. Good morning. We have with you Frédéric DENÈFLE, you're the general manager of GAREX. Good morning. Pascal DUBOIS, the deputy timekeeper and general manager of CESAM. Sophie MOYSAN, chief legal officer of the RÉUNION AÉRIENNE, and you'll be our aviation expert, and François-Xavier PIEDFORT from Helvetia, head of the cargo committee of France ASSUREURS. Good morning. So, we all know the situation. On 24 February, many were surprised. The presentation that we had yesterday really set the scene, but operationally speaking, what happened for you? So let's backtrack 3 months and let's look at the various phases of this crisis. Frédéric DENÈFLE, you agreed to prepare for the exercise with a few slides. Well, in terms of shipping insurance and geopolitics, maps are a must, and you have to illustrate what you're saying. So here you've got Ukraine. It's a country of 600,000 square kilometers and with 3,000 kilometers of seafront, and 1,000 near the Azov Sea and 2,000 on the Black Sea. This country is crisscrossed by rail lines and a fairly extensive river network and canal network that almost entirely ends on the Black Sea or the Azov Sea. A few ports, Mariupol, of course, Kherson, Mykolaiv or Odessa, and 2 ports that are on the Danube, Izmail and Reni, that have become very important in the last few weeks. From 25 February onwards, 2022, ports were closed, a number of ships were destroyed, and the forces scattered mines near port access. So this direct impact for the Ukrainian maritime seafront is more and more precisely measured. Yesterday, Captain Briand talked about the Azov Sea as a sort of Russian lake. I liked this phrase, and that's something I'll make my own to describe the current situation. The Russian forces have moved or advanced on the east of the country. They fully control the Azov Sea, and this is a very threatening situation for the other trade ports in the west of the country. So now Ukraine has lost access to the Azov Sea. Ukrainian exports are reduced to almost nothing because of destruction on harbor infrastructure, and what little trade you have on the Azov Sea is 100% Russian. I'll remind you that last week a first boat left Mariupol loaded with steel, if my memory serves, to go to Rostov-on-the-Don. On the other side of the Azov Sea, it was a symbolic reminder that Russia fully controls the situation and they're ready to provide their support to regional trade, but the Sea of Azov is fully controlled by the Russians. The practical consequences that we can try to look at here are the potential losses for the various players. in the maritime world and the import-export world. We know that there are roughly 100 ships blocked in the various ports where traffic is at a standstill. About 100 ships, an estimated value of about $1 billion. The goods on these ships are in the warehouses of these various ports that are still blocked. Roughly $2 billion, and the goods are warehoused inland, and we know that there are a lot of farm products that are stored, a lot of chemicals as well, a lot of oil products also that are stored, and that's roughly $4 billion. The insurers involved are the war risk insurers for the hulls, also involved in P&I. There was some damage to some ships. Some boats were also destroyed or sunk during military operations, and also ships that will be immobilized for lengthy periods, and so contractually they could be decided as constructive total losses. That's for hulls. For P&I, well, that's for crews. We needed to carry out commando operations by ship owners to try and rescue the crews and help repatriate them. Well, that's a very big responsibility and very costly, and here the P&I side will need to shoulder that. There will be damage to goods that could lead to claims. For cargo insurers, of course, the goods that were damaged because of the conflict, that will probably end up on the desk of the war risk insurers. Some of them, simply because of the time that has elapsed, will be classified as total losses. Farm goods cannot be stored for a long time in uncontrolled conditions, so that could lead to claims as well. And still, common averages declared on a couple of boats that were attacked during transport, and that could also lead to the fact that cargo insurers will need to step in. And there's another type of insurers involved in transport insurers for war risk inventories that are still in the country and are subject to deteriorations or attacks because of military operations. Upcoming risks are easy to summarize. Here you have a satellite picture of the estuary of the Danube. For each green dot, you have a barge or a maritime or a river barge that is waiting to go up the Danube to collect goods that will be delivered to the two ports that are accessible on the Danube. And so they will go back and forth to evacuate the goods and to repatriate them to Constanța. So now there's an accumulation of ships near the mouth of the Danube Delta, waiting their turn to load and offload mostly farm products. So an accumulation, that's a navigation risk by definition, because where you have a lot of ships parked near one another, there's a risk of collision. And also, you never know, it's close to Snake Island that Captain Bryant was talking about yesterday, so there could be a military operation on these areas where the ships are parked, and that could lead to additional damage, both to goods and on the boats themselves. And then you have a list of issues related to global inflation. Both Ukraine and Russia are major producers of farm products, wheat, durum wheat and soft wheat and other cereals, and that they can no longer export, so prices are going up. And there are also other economic risks that I won't dwell on because Professor Chalmin probably will. And there's mainstream inflation. It's also fertile ground for social unrest, possibilities of riots and insurgency, things that could be covered by war risk insurers, so global disruptions that could be found everywhere amongst assimilated war risks, risks of coercion by some states that could decide to seize goods, and more generally, all these embargoes and economic sanctions can lead to a reduction in maritime trade and so a reduction in the insurable base. Sophie, what is the bill to be footed by aviation insurers? Well, for us, the situation overlaps what you described. There were some destructions of aircraft, 4 to 5 aircraft that were destroyed in Ukraine because of the invasion. But already in and of itself, that makes incidents much more serious. This is a very small sector. That's about $150 million for war risk insurers in aviation. So that's the first issue with claims. But the big problem with claims is what you discussed. You talked about ships being blocked. In aviation at this beginning, we had roughly 500 aircraft that were blocked in Russia, not directly because of the war, but because of sanctions that were imposed and counter-sanctions adopted by the West, especially the EU and the UK and the US and others. But then counter-sanctions, reprisal measures adopted by the Russian authorities. And the result is that most of these aircraft, there are roughly 400 of them, according to latest estimates. So yes, they are operated, and most of them are still operated in Russia, but these aircraft are operated by Russian airlines, but they belong to lessors, mostly financial companies, and a lot of them are either based in Russia, in Ireland, or in Bermuda, and so mostly owned by Westerners. So the bill that we have in mind, the orders of magnitude, we know that the total value, approximate value of these planes blocked in Russia is roughly $13 billion. That's the market value. That is not necessarily the insured value, because the insured value is an agreed value, and agreed values are always slightly boosted by a number of items by financial companies. So if you look at the agreed value, it's roughly $18 billion in potential losses for lessors. And keep in mind that for war risk, there are annual aggregates in the aviation sector, and so possibly the bill can be brought down to $13 billion for total loss. And yet, it's not at all certain that there will be a real total loss of these aircraft. So the range is between $6 and $18 billion. So you can see that's a considerable amount for the sector, really considerable. It's bigger than the claims for the World Trade Center attacks, 9/11. So yes, the aviation business is really shaken up by all these developments. François-Xavier Piedfort, have you done your maths, or is that still too early?
It's a bit complicated to do the maths because, given the current situation, we don't have enough information about the claims. Frédéric talked about billions, but that's just an estimate. At the last committee meeting, we realized it was very complicated, except for a couple of traders who were able to identify the actual claims. And apart from the reshipping costs, because the merchandise was sent elsewhere, it's impossible to figure out. Now, 4 months after the beginning of the conflict, the situation is unheard of. And what complicates matters further is that we have a lot of demand from our insurers. We can make estimates, granted, calling on brokers and customers, but basically we don't have any real figures, not even approximate figures. And this is an unheard of situation for us. What's definite is that as time goes by, where the quality of the merchandise is being impaired and the goods are not available. So after a certain amount of time, customers will be entitled to ask for compensation. And in fact, they will ask to be paid for their claim, and the goods will remain in the hands of the insurers. So that further complicates matters. Frédéric BÉCARD, what's your stance? Well, aviation, it's very interesting to see this ricochet effect of the Ukrainian crisis on Russia. So we're talking about billions of potential losses. Here, the risk profile is a bit different when you look at Ukraine. Strangely enough, we're talking about big grain exporters, which it's not so much a risk for the transporters. As Xavier was saying, we can't really measure things for the time being. However, via the blocking and trapping clauses, this will obviously give rise to claims in the future. As to actually quantifying the claims, it'll be quite substantial. That's what we know. It's also interesting to note what kinds of guarantees will be invoked. Risk of war, obviously, but perhaps ordinary risks too. For the time being, we're waiting for the wave to crash, but we haven't really been able to measure it in any precise way. It's probably a bit too early as well, but what about the questions this gives rise to? Some things may have to be modified or called into question in your contracts and in your relationships. First question. Will it be possible in the future to take insurance against risks of war? Shall I start? It's a tricky issue. Well, this is my personal view, and I think it's fairly widely shared. The main guiding principles will remain the same. We're in a crisis. There have been crises in the past. Conversely, and François-Xavier will no doubt explain this, we'll have to be more rigorous perhaps when it comes to underwriting the risk of war and the pricing of this coverage. That's not something our customers or brokers like. But obviously, the loss ratio created by this event will give rise to the allocation of capital questions, the limits, and I think we'll also have to look at the clauses in terms of the claims that will be filed. François-Xavier? Well, at the beginning of my career, there was a different rate for risks of war and ordinary risks. Now we have a sort of a global rate. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between risk of war and ordinary risk, depending on the circumstances. We're not going to say someone else is to blame. Given the current situation, which is unheard of, as I said, there are claims linked to the risk of war. That doesn't usually concern the transport of merchandise, because the war zones didn't transport much merchandise. In this case, it's not true at all. It's the contrary. We won't have to revisit guarantees necessarily, but perhaps the pricing. I think the guarantees are right. On the French market, we have a real plus. We have this extended guarantee which is offered, which is not true of other markets, and we have to retain this specificity. However, the right price has to be paid for this extended guarantee. Pascal Dubois, things have changed? Yes. CESAM supports the insurers, of course. The services provided by the committee concern the whole of the market. The crisis in Ukraine has changed a number of things. There have been certain virtues, though, certain benefits. Let's just go back in time a bit. In 2018, the CCR withdrew from exceptional risks, and the French market is in a special situation. We have a guarantee called end-to-end guarantee. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Over and above this guarantee, the CCR delivered a special clause for countries. Now, the CCR, following a discussion on the market, and CESAM has taken up this point. All the players felt that it would be relevant for the French market to keep a clean slate, so to speak. It's easy to have this easy, clear kind of rating, But obviously, certain countries were assessed by the English-speaking market in a very different way from the French, particularly if you look at Central Africa or West Africa. In English ratings, these countries are assessed in a less correct or fair way than what we feel on the French market. And when I talk about rating, it means the conditions of underpinning the guarantees, ensuring things at a given price, minimizing the possibility of ensuring certain flows in a traditional way for French shippers or the French market. So in 2018, we adopted a rating in French, which is very close to that of the CCR. Now, to go back to the crisis in Ukraine, we've become aware of several points. First of all, in 2018, we thought that following this exceptional situation, an exceptional crisis unit could be set up. And that's what happened for the very first time. This crisis unit comprises the president of the Transported Goods Committee, the president of the Risks of War Committee, Frédéric, France-Assureurs, Jean-Paul, and CESAM. And they came together in order to take a certain number of measures. The crisis unit met twice, very quickly, on the very day, in fact. CESAM reacted right away, and when I say CESAM, I mean all the players on the French market. So we met in order to adjust the rating of Ukraine, and when I say Ukraine, I mean all the countries which are our neighbors. That's the first benefit. In other words, we were able to act very fast. The market showed that it could react immediately, in fact. And then there were 3 committees on the risks of war, which CESAM was invited to attend, together with the Transported Merchandise Committee. The idea was to adjust the rating. Here again, there was a benefit here, because we realized that the rating that was created by CESAM was based on a risk of real, an assessment of real risks, listed risks. However, when there's an unforeseen circumstance, that means there's a possible risk, and we felt the rating wasn't particularly suited to a situation like the one in Ukraine, because we were talking about potential risks. Hence, the structuring of the rating had to be totally changed in depth. And if I may continue, there were other virtues, other benefits as well. We managed to lend momentum to the players on the French market. We led them to meet together. CESAM was positioned as a service provider by the agency that works for us. It's a unit on geostrategic intelligence, and they helped us with the rating. CESAM groups together 26 measures currently, all sorts of different companies. CESAM, in its own little corner, doesn't decide on the rating. The rating proposed is fully discussed with all the players. So we had a certain number of meetings, and we were able to discuss the matter. And some companies had very different approaches or stances. Those were the benefits that emerged from the situation. We were able to react extremely quickly, and in fact, it was quite outstanding. Sophie Moison, can we talk about virtues or benefits? Well, we didn't really see that with the international aviation market. Things didn't move as fast, but the circumstances for us are not the same. The major claim, as I said earlier on, is all these planes which are blocked in Ukraine. There's a huge uncertainty when it comes to who will cover these claims for a number of reasons. There were a certain number of claims which were declared by the various lessors, and these claims filed concerned several different markets. I'd like to specify how coverage on the aviation market is provided for risks of war. It's a bit different. The basic rule is that in all the aviation insurance contracts, those of airline companies and lessors, there's an exclusion systematically of risks of war in the broad sense of the word, not just risk of foreign or civil war, but risk of confiscation, nationalization, and all sorts of other risks like terrorism, planes being diverted. So aviation insurance doesn't normally cover the risks of war. In basic aviation policies, there is a coverage of civil liability, but it's been limited since the 11th of September. And insofar as we are concerned, that is the risk in Russia when it comes to the actual aircraft, there is no buyback clause by standard insurers. That risk is covered by a special market where we find some of the players on the main market, but not everybody. It's a small market with not huge amounts of cash involved. When it comes to the claims filed, and above all, those filed to date, lessors, in fact, are searching in all directions, given the scope of their losses. One can understand that. And they haven't just triggered the risk of war market, but also insurers on the ordinary risk market. To be more specific, insurers, be it ordinary risks or risks of war insurers, they insure two kinds of exposure. The exposure of airline companies. The main guarantee for lessors is in the airline company policies through a covenant that protects them specifically. And then, as I said, they also have other additional guarantees that cover them specifically as operators. Because of the situation, there's a huge amount of uncertainty as to actual coverage, though, for the time being. The evaluation is very vague in terms of the extent of losses. We don't know whether the coverage will be there when it comes to risks of war. Yes, risk of confiscation, nationalization, that's covered. The Russians have re-registered the planes blocked in Russia, and that's really political. It's clearly a question of war. Despite everything, however, lessors will also try to trigger ordinary risk clauses without much chance of succeeding. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, though, as I said. There's uncertainty in terms of the event. When is the date of the claim? Doesn't date from the invasion of Ukraine. What immobilized ships in ports was the European sanctions and then the Russian sanctions in retaliation. But what date do you adopt? In the meantime, the lessors themselves have terminated their rental contracts, their leases. Therefore, they should no longer benefit from coverage as operators. So the date of the claim is crucial. Is the date before termination of the contract or not? And we, aviation insurers, we were targets. We were targeted by these sanctions. In aviation, a lot of sanctions were adopted by the EU, banning Russian aircraft from flying over EU territory, ban on exporting aeronautical equipment to Russia, and so on and so forth. Also, there was a ban on insuring aeronautical goods, that is, planes mainly, that would be operated by Russians and used in Russia. So here again, the question of the actual date of the claim is a huge question mark, even when it comes to hull and risks of war. The risk of war insurers have stopped covering the planes blocked in Russia. So it's impossible to sort out. It's a huge tangle. There's no visibility. There hasn't been a concrete reaction. There's been an increase in the rate when it comes to risk of war coverage, but that's not commensurate with the potential claims, which are totally atypical and colossal. It's a bit too early for the aeronautical market to say much. So you think there'll be a legal battle? Yes, I'm sure there will be changes, and not just changes in rates. I'm sure there'll be clauses that will be rewritten. For the time being, people have adopted a wait-and-see attitude. We have this huge threat of all these claims, which will rain down on us when it comes to the aviation market. Frédéric, what do you view in terms of possible changes? What will have to be changed in the contracts and in the organization of the market? Well, it's difficult to draw any academic conclusions at this stage. I think the first thing we can say is that with as maritime insurers, we insure against risks of war, and we're not that many on the market. If you look at all the guarantees covering the risk of war, you have aviation risks, political risks in the broad sense of the term. You have credit risks too, and that's about all. Some people cover terrorism, but the systematic nature of the risk of war is not as flagrant as what you find in shipping insurance. We are risk of war insurers with our extended guarantees, and covering a risk of war, it's hard to actually master the situation. You have to fully understand what you're doing. You have to agree on the guarantees. That is something to do in-house. And then you have to analyze what we're exposing ourselves to, trip by trip, merchandise by merchandise. Then there's a second lesson, which we'll also have to think about together. And this harks back to what we said in the first round table. We don't have enough professionals on the market to follow a ship which is in danger, entering a difficult port, having trouble with merchandise in transit somewhere. We're going to have to improve tracking and tracing in order to ensure that all the partners regain their trust and confidence. We have reinsurers, co-insurers who may be called upon when it comes to risks of war. We have to show that even vis-à-vis the risk of war, we're better in control of our exposure and the monitoring of these risks. That's what I would like to call the profession to think about. François-Xavier or Frédéric, will things really change in terms of warranties? Well, when it comes to guarantees, there's no problem. We have the terms and conditions. When it comes to the companies, companies don't exclude the same countries. Russia, well, some countries exclude Russia and other kind of Belarus. We've talked about zoning, that's fine and dandy, but what kind of zoning should we adopt? We need a broad agreement. I'm not saying the CESAM should do this or that. We used to have a single rate applied across the board. That's no longer the case now. So the issue is insurance versus co-insurance, because the rate provided by the lead insurer may not be the same applied by all. So for brokers, this creates a very disorganized situation. And then you have to analyze the risk. There's the issue of reinsurance. Some countries are excluded, some risks are excluded, and that's hard to explain to a broker or to a customer, that we don't have the same vision of things. Unfortunately, we'll find ourselves increasingly in this kind of procedure or system. It's not particularly pleasant, and it's something we hadn't necessarily taken into account now, but we will have to in the future. Frédéric, are we going to change the contracts too? In terms of what François-Xavier was saying, I think over and above the points he raised, you have the issue of compliance. And when I say compliance, I'm talking about the internal strategy of each insurance company. Even if we're trying to be a uniform market in terms of conditions and guarantees, when we have a company strategy, company positions, company policies, and a given insurance company may have a different vision of a given country or a given risks. And that's what has been highlighted in the situation in Ukraine. I think the main guiding principles will remain when it comes to insurance contracts. We talk today a lot about inflation. Here we've experienced a real inflation in terms of crises, amounts, and tension on a market which was pretty soft and smooth. In terms of recurrence, we had the pandemic, and now we have the Ukrainian crisis. So things are becoming ever more systemic, ever more recurrent. Hence, we may have to revisit the way in which we view risk. That will be the big difference between being proactive and just reacting. Insurers always tended just to react in terms of the international financial system. If we overly become proactive, maybe we could be accused of being too far ahead of the market and imposing conditions that are not acceptable, particularly in terms of rates. And this may be difficult to explain when nothing's happening, when there's no real crisis. So I think this will leave an imprint when it comes to risks of war, for example. For how long? I don't know. That's something we cannot foresee. We must all become aware of the fact that it's necessary to have the right tools, the right prices, so that we can continue to cover insured parties. François-Xavier, you touched on the extended French-style guarantee. Is it nearly the end of that? Well, it's hard to give precise figures when talking about the crisis in Ukraine. I'm speaking in my own personal capacity, not on behalf of the market, but I think it would be unfortunate to stop the extended guarantee. We've had it for years. We've insisted on this specificity of the French insurance company. Now, if we stop it at this stage, I think that would be unfortunate. However, we have to pay the right price for this extended guarantee. Pascal, do you want to give a quick reaction? Well, quick, I don't know. I'd like to react to what François-Xavier was saying. CESAM, of course, is a kind of watchkeeper. It got lots of calls from companies, from brokers. The extended guarantee terms and conditions are something specific to the French market, and I think we should keep it. It's not because there's a first huge claim that this should be called into question. A couple of years ago, the risk manager of Mercuria, it was probably in 2018, said this specificity on the French market is quite unique in the world. Keep it. I'm sorry to go so fast. I believe that the Ukrainian crisis has made us aware on the market of a certain number of things that don't work properly. I understand that it's very difficult for a broker to manage his or her business with differentiated or verticalized investments and different conditions amongst co-insurers. Some people are withdrawing, other people remain. That's that first dimension of the situation. And just to go a bit further, I'm unraveling the ball of wool. We have to look at the mode of functioning of the insurance market. It's not like a risk of war. A risk of war has its own specificities, granted. But the way in which our market functions is first and foremost based on ordinary risks. So we have to wonder about the way the market works. And there's some very down-to-earth things like certain clauses which no longer exist. I therefore think we have to rethink the situation in toto. With the crisis in Ukraine, we've held a lot of exchanges, and I think that they should lead to an improvement in the ease with which we deal with our business in general. You're resolutely optimistic. I would tend to support that. We're coming to the end of the discussion in this roundtable. What is the really key message you want to convey to the market? If we are to sum up things, what's your main message? Frédéric, for example. I'm repeating myself, perhaps. The geopolitics is a little bit like plate tectonics. It's constantly moving. We're a financial instrument. We're here to provide support, and the key message is that we have to accept that we need to anticipate on risks. Insurers are specialists when it comes to transport and shipping. It's a very technical approach, as underscored by Pascal. This will enable us to remain a major player in international trade. And of course, we have to abide by the rules of profitability. We go from one crisis to the next. Sometimes it takes us too long to react. It's a sort of a seesaw movement, which customers and brokers don't necessarily appreciate. And I think we should anticipate more. As Frédéric was saying, we also have to agree that and accept the fact these risks are major, and there have to be adequate provisions set aside. What's your key message, Frédéric? I don't want to restate what Frédéric has just mentioned. I would like to draw attention to the fact that war is a long-lived thing. We have a war that's being waged before our very eyes. The media talk about it non-stop. We know what's happening in Ukraine, but there are lots of other wars elsewhere. The conflict in Ukraine, well, Ukraine has 4 borders with European countries. It's almost at the heart of Europe, and the war can spread elsewhere. The Danzig Straits, we have Moldavia. There are a certain number of places which in turn may become exposed to war. So all the operators in world trade have to factor this into their risk analysis. And also, war takes many different shapes today. People are thinking about how war is going to evolve. War will become ever more tricky, complicated, economic, and there may really be blockades which will halt the movement of merchandise owing to a kind of IT war. This kind of crisis is a very major one. It should enable the market to work, as specified in our roundtables, to work in a much more coherent, unified manner. That's exactly what we're witnessing. It's a very good trend, unfortunately, against a horrible background. Sophie MOYSAN, given the scope of the claim, although this is clearly covered by the risk of war, it goes without saying that it will be necessary to introduce changes. And this will affect the rest of the shipping market. I'd like to talk about the different forms in which war may be waged. War is not just a traditional war as we know it. You have a cyber aspect, which is also very important. What I increasingly note is that we have a sort of legal wars. For insurers, this creates ever more complex, expensive constraints. There are all sorts of sanctions against sanctions which vary on the country. There are blockages, extraterritorial legislation. It's becoming ever more difficult to operate on a global scale for players in our sector. And the aeronautical industry is clearly affected. Aviation insurance is something that's very global, and we're increasingly faced with very complicated issues in terms of complying with sanctions. How can we abide by all these situations when you have belligerents and the demands are very contradictory? Provisions may be fairly ambiguous. Let me give you just a quick example. When insurance sanctions were taken by the EU, when it comes to the aviation industry, key questions were asked, can we still ensure foreign operators outside the EU and Britain, say Turks or Chinese, who continue to serve Russia? If we can't do that, then the aircraft can't fly anymore according to civil aviation laws because of the risk of war. So there's a great ambiguity when it comes to continuing to ensure the lessors of aircraft located in Russia. And this issue has only been resolved in the last few days. So we find ourselves in impossible situations. This is not a strong message, but we have this growing constraint, which I believe will have to be addressed on the scale of a whole global market. François-Xavier?
Just one sentence. Well, we need to look at risk of war, risks, and ascribe a price to this guarantee. Otherwise, the risk is that we won't be able to offer guarantees on extended war risk because the results will be very bad. So I would like us to spend more time on the war risk aspect in view of the Ukrainian crisis. Of course, that risk is now obvious to everybody. Thank you to the five of you.